On November 7, 1811, in Battle Ground, Indiana, American forces under the command of Indiana Territory Governor William Henry Harrison engaged in combat with tribal forces led by Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, and his brother Tenskwatawa, also known as the Prophet, who led a confederacy of different tribes opposed to European American colonization of the American frontier. Governor Harrison led an army of around 1,000 soldiers in an assault on the Confederacy's headquarters at Prophetstown, which is close to the meeting point of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers, as tensions and bloodshed escalated. After being named governor of the newly established Indiana Territory in 1800, William Henry Harrison worked to get land titles so that people may settle there. In the Treaty of Fort Wayne, the second of these treaties following the first in 1803, he negotiated land cession treaties with the Miami, Potawatomi, Lenape, and other tribes, resulting in the United States acquiring 3 million acres, about 12,000 square kilometers. Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief, was against the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809. He held that since all tribes shared ownership of the land, some land pieces could not be sold without the consent of all tribes. Joseph Brant, the Mohawk leader of the previous generation, promoted a similar ideology and demanded that the tribes be united. Tenskwatawa, sometimes referred to as the Prophet, was Tecumseh's younger brother and a spiritual leader who promoted a return to ancestral customs among the tribes in the Northwest. Despite his opposition to the 1809 pact, Tecumseh was hesitant to go face the United States head-on, threatening to slaughter chiefs and warriors who upheld the conditions of the treaty. He urged warriors to forsake their chiefs and join his cause while traversing tribe areas, creating a resistance in Prophetstown. Tecumseh met Governor Harrison at Grouseland, Harrison's house near Vincennes, in 1810. Tecumseh insisted that the pact be revoked and that the tribes be given their territories back. Harrison mocked the notion of shared land ownership and maintained that each tribe had unique and distinct agreements with the U.S. Tecumseh made it plain that if the territories were returned, he would serve the Americans with loyalty. If not, he would look to form an alliance with the British. Tecumseh was hesitant to form an alliance with the British because he knew they employed the tribes to wage their battles on the border, although British operatives had attempted to do so as early as 1810. However, in November 1810, after forming alliances with the Potawatomi and Odawa and reaching out to the Iowa, he traveled to Canada to speak with the British and Canadians. The next year, Harrison accused the Shawnee of stealing a boatload of salt and killing a few men on the frontier, but more significantly, he wrote Washington a series of letters asking for authorization to move against them. He said, "In Indian warfare, there is no security but in offensive measures." In the summer of 1811, he called Tecumseh to a conference. Tecumseh continued to be an articulate speaker, but the meeting was unsuccessful. Tecumseh ordered Harrison to wait until he returned before starting to settle on the disputed territories, after telling him he was going to recruit among the Muskogee and Choctaws. He pleaded with Harrison and Tenskwatawa that he wanted no mischief while he was away. Tenskwatawa remained with the Shawnee, who were encamped at Prophetstown's Tippecanoe, a community that had expanded to include several hundred buildings and a substantial population. Although estimates vary from 350 to 1,000, he had around 500 men available at the time of the conflict. Smaller Shawnee, Wyandot, and other national units were arranged under Roundhead, while the Kickapoo under Mangwatawa, Potawatomi under Waubensee, and Winnebago under Waweapakusa were grouped into huge units of 125. In a subsequent letter to Charles Scott, Harrison expressed his opinion that Tecumseh's warriors were the finest light infantry troops in the world, and he claimed that the Confederacy had superior weaponry to the majority of his own army. Tecumseh's soldiers were equipped with spears to fend against bayonet attacks, which the United States successfully employed at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, in addition to muskets, knives, tomahawks, and clubs. There was a communication breakdown among Tenskwatawa's defenders. Iroquoian or Algonquian languages were spoken in the majority of countries, and many members of those communities were multilingual. However, the sizable Winnebago army needed interpretation, since they spoke the Ho-Chunk language, which is a member of the Siouan family. Harrison thought that the best way to deal with violent tribes was to use military force. In order to maintain harmony with the Native Americans, Secretary of War William Eustis stated, "But if the prophet should commence or seriously threaten hostilities, he ought to be attacked." Harrison made many demands in a string of letters to Tenskwatawa. He prohibited non-Shawnee citizens from Prophetstown, accused the Shawnee of stealing horses, and accused Tenskwatawa's followers of killing white people in Illinois, a crime that was most likely committed by Maine Pak and his Potawatomi. Tenskwatawa did not answer the other demands, but he did respond that the horses would be restored. Harrison began to assemble troops. Under the command of U.S. District Attorney Joseph Hamilton Davis of Kentucky, around 120 cavalry volunteers and 400 militia from Indiana arrived. Colonel John Parker Boyd commanded 300 Army regulars, along with several indigenous scouts. He had around 1,000 soldiers in all. North of Vincennes at Fort Knox, Harrison assembled the dispersed militia companies. When they arrived in Terre Haute, Indiana, they set up camp and constructed Fort Harrison. In October, the men were trained, resupplied, and the fort was constructed. After being freed, a party of Delaware leaders who were on their way to Harrison were caught by the Shawnee and ordered to serve as negotiators. They arrived at the end of October with reports of many violent acts. Harrison viewed the shooting of a sentry outside the fort as an aggressive conduct that warranted military reprisal against Prophetstown. "There is nothing left to do but chastise him, Tenskwatawa, and he will undoubtedly receive it," he wrote to Eustis. On November 6th, Harrison's troops moved toward Prophetstown. Though he thought the negotiations were pointless, he was scheduled to meet with Tenskwatawa the following day. On the recommendation of Harrison's aide-de-camp Bartholomew, the troops set up camp on Burnett's Creek, Battleground, Indiana. They were fully equipped and clothed. The camp was lighted by the fires they kept burning in the rain, while positioned in pickets in accordance with battle lines. Harrison did not order the construction of fortifications. 2 companies of sentries patrolled the perimeter. The southernmost point of the camp's perimeter was occupied by Captain Spear Spencer's Indiana Yellow Jacket riflemen, who were distinguished by their light-colored buckskins. Along the borders of the cliff that surrounded the camp, the remaining militia formed an asymmetrical rectangular shape. All infantry forces defending the front line were led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bartholomew. Under the leadership of Major Floyd, Major Davis, and former Congressman Captain Benjamin Park, the regulars and dragoons were held in reserve behind the main line. Tenskwatawa told Michigan Governor Lewis Cass in 1816 that he did not order his warriors to attack Harrison, and he blamed the Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, warriors in his camp for launching the attack. Not long after the battle, a Kickapoo chief told British Indian agent Matthew Elliott that the shooting of 2 Winnebago warriors by the sentries aroused the indignation of the Indians, and they determined to be revenged, and accordingly commenced the attack. Tenskwatawa's followers were worried by the nearby army and feared an imminent attack. Although they hadn't finished their defenses, they had started to fortify the town. Tenskwatawa appears to have consented to a preemptive strike against the Americans, and to sending a team in under cover of darkness to kill Harrison in his tent during a council meeting on the evening of November 6th. He promised the warriors that he would employ spells to keep them safe and confuse Harrison's garrison so they wouldn't fight back. In an attempt to get into the camp without being seen, the soldiers started to encircle Harrison's troops. One of Harrison's army's wagon drivers, Ben, had escaped to the Shawnees while the mission was underway. He consented to bring a troop of fighters past the line to Harrison's tent late at night, but the camp sentries caught him, brought him back to camp, and chained him. Harrison pardoned him, even though he was ultimately found guilty of treason. Although the exact start of the combat is unknown, Harrison's sentinels came into contact with advancing fighters in the early hours of November 7th. The men were instructed to sleep with their rifles loaded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bartholomew, who was the officer of the day. The soldiers discovered that Tenskwatawa's men were almost encircling them when they woke up at 4:30 a.m. to sporadic gunfire. Initially, contact was established on the left side of the perimeter, followed by the front, right, and back of the camp. Both Captain Frederick Geiger's Kentucky militia and Captain Robert Barton's regulars were immediately attacked with great vigor and were unable to defend their ground. Harrison substituted the Indiana militia, led by Lieutenant Peters, for them when their leader, Wentworth, was killed in the initial assault. Harrison discovered the front line, which was facing Prophetstown, being fired upon by soldiers positioned in a tree grove. As the onslaught persisted, the Americans remained in their positions, with the regulars supporting that crucial portion of the line. The warriors rushed the defenders, unaffected by the militia's small-caliber weapons. Tenskwatawa's war chiefs were Stone Eater and White Loon. The Prophet took up position on a little hill with a view of the conflict. Because the element of surprise was lost at the beginning of the combat, the warriors were forced to launch many minor attacks in an unorganized and disorderly manner. Every time Harrison's forces drove the Americans away, they reformed and charged them. In the meantime, rifle-wielding fighters made their way from the trees to the line while crawling on their bellies. Major Davis led the dragoons in a countercharge on the camp's northern edge. After the attack, Davis was killed. Although the majority of his company later retreated to Harrison's main line, the regulars of the 4th Regiment cleared the grove. The strongest onslaught came from behind. Under intense fire, the Indiana Yellow Jackets were unable to maintain their position, and Captain Spencer, their commander, had been killed. Harrison's telegram to Eustis on November 18, 1811, records his death. Spencer was wounded in the head. He urged his soldiers to battle hard. As he continued to support them, he was shot in both thighs and collapsed. He was then lifted up and struck with a ball, which instantly ended his life. Harrison closed the gap in the line by transferring 2 reserve companies, commanded by Captain Robb, to join Spencer's lone surviving officer, Ensign John Tipton. Harrison's forces repulsed a number of more charges throughout the course of the following hour. As the dawn rose, it became clear that Tenskwatawa's forces were getting smaller and rapidly dispersing into the woods as the warriors started to run out of ammo. Harrison's soldiers followed. They scalped 36 soldiers after finding their remains in the woods. Harrison suffered 188 losses during the roughly 2-hour-long battle. 25 were seriously wounded and 37 died in combat. A further 126 were wounded in less severe ways. With all but 1 officer slain, the Yellow Jackets sustained the greatest number of casualties throughout the conflict. Although the exact number of Native American losses is still up for controversy, it was unquestionably less than the American soldiers. According to historians, between 70 and 80 people were injured and up to 50 people were murdered. According to one chief's story, the warriors withdrew to Prophetstown, where they faced Tenskwatawa and accused him of dishonesty due to the numerous fatalities that his spells were meant to have saved. He promised to do a fresh spell and accused his wife of desecrating his magic medication. He demanded that the warriors assault again, but they refused. Harrison dispatched a small team of men to investigate the Shawnee settlement the next day, November 8th, and discovered that everyone was gone except for an elderly woman who was too ill to go. Overnight, the rest of the vanquished peasants had fled. Harrison gave the order to fire the whole settlement, including the storehouse's 5,000 bushels of maize and beans. In addition, he had the local cemetery excavated, leaving bodies scattered around. Many of the American corpses were dug up and dispersed by the villagers in revenge when Harrison's forces left the region.